Back in the garage, back in the garage, in the garage, in the garage, back in the garage today, back in the garage, back in the garage today. Back in the garage today working on my 2017 KTM 250 XCF. In today's video, we're going to check the valve clearance on the bike and also replace the spark plug. Now, if I do end up needing to adjust the valves, that's not gonna happen today because I don't have shims of the right diameter. So hopefully it checks out within spec, but if not, I'll show you how to adjust the valves should I need to, but let's get to work. Now the first thing you need to do is remove the fuel tank. There's a separate video on that. I'm not going to show that today, but I'll link it up here in the corner of the screen so you can check that part out if you're unsure how to remove your fuel tank. Now this isn't the cleanest bike at the moment, but you should clean up all around the motor area as much as you can up here around the valve cover, because we don't want dirt and debris dropping down into the engine once we get this valve cover off. The first step's pretty simple. We're just going to unplug the spark plug wire right here. Alright, so with the plug wire disconnected, now we're going to grab a spark plug wrench and get the spark plug out of the bike. Alright, so here's what my spark plug looks like after about a year of riding. Definitely in need of replacement. Alright, so over on the right hand side of the bike, we need to remove the right side radiator guard. That's done by taking these two screws out, and then we'll move on to the next step. Alright, so we got the radiator guard removed. The reason why we want to do that is that allows us to pivot this radiator out of the way just a little bit when we go to get into the valve cover. Alright, so next up we're going to take this clamp, slide it back on the vent hose, and then slide the vent hose off the top of the valve cover. And then we have 1, 2, 3 screws we need to remove in order to get this thing the rest of the way off. Alright, now we're ready to remove the 10mm valve cover bolts. Alright, so we have the bolts removed. We're going to remove the valve cover, but we're actually going to pull it off to the right-hand side of the motor, or right-hand side of the bike. Alright, so I've got the valve cover off of the motor. Now you might be able to see where the gasket tried to come off with it. I'm going to go back over there and carefully remove that gasket because hopefully we're going to be able to reuse it. Alright, so I got the gasket removed from the bike. You can tell there's plenty of sealant used on it, whoever put it on last. This all looks pretty clean over here. We're going to clean all this up before we go to put it back together. But this side over here has a bunch of gasket sealers, so I'm going to go ahead and start to clean this up before I move on to actually checking these valves. Alright, so over here on the left-hand side of the engine, we are going to remove this cover, or not cover, but this screw, plug, whatever you want to call it, right here next. I'll have to see what size that is, and I'll flash it up on the screen, but it looks like a hex head. Alright, so we've got that screw removed, which now gives us access to this bolt, which will allow us to turn the motor over so we can start to get the timing marks lined up. Now this is best to do if you have a buddy or somebody out here to help you, because what we're going to do is crank the motor and we've got to line up the timing marks. Unfortunately, the timing marks are on the right hand side of the bike, and the way we're going to have to turn it's over on the left hand side, and I'm out here by myself today, so we'll see how this goes. Too far. Alright, so if you're like Gumby and you can reach through there, you can actually do this by yourself by turning on the other side while watching on this side. You can see I've got the timing marks. They're pretty damn close. I'll check them here a little bit closer. But we've got the 2 painted dots. We basically want that, and I don't know if you guys can see it. There are a couple little marks on there too. We want those aligned across from each other, which should coincide with the top of the cylinder here, letting us know it's at top dead center. All right, so once again, make sure your engine is at top dead center, and then you are ready to check the valve clearance. Now I've gone ahead and checked mine off camera and everything is perfectly within spec, but let me explain how to do this. First off, you need to refer to your owner's manual or repair manual to find out what the clearance spec is. In the case of my intake valve, it's 0.10 to 0.15 millimeters. The exhaust valve is 0.13 to 0.18 millimeters. In order to check your valve clearance, you will need a set of feeler gauges. I've got about 3 sets because they all have slightly different measurements and slightly different variations to them. What you want to do is, well, we'll start with the intake valves. All right, so you have your exhaust valve and your intake valve. If you get confused, you don't know which one is which, The exhaust valve is closer to the exhaust, the intake valve is closer to the intake. You're probably going to have to take your feeler gauge off of the little holder because you don't have much room in here. And basically what you want to do is take your feeler gauge, it's going to be really tough to see in here, and you're going to run your feeler gauge through the cam and the cam lever. It's a little hard to see right there. I'm just going to leave that in place. Now, what you want to do is get the right size feeler gauge, and you're going to have to do this with a few different feeler gauges. You want to make sure that whatever the skinniest one is or whatever the thinnest one is, you can't fit one through that's thinner than that, and whatever the thickest one is, you can't fit one through that's thicker than that one. All right, so I need to interrupt this video for just a minute because what I said didn't totally make sense, and I'm probably going to say something similar again. So what I'm talking about is when it comes to checking the valve clearance, whatever your thickest feeler gauge is, you want to make sure you can't fit a size thicker through the cam and cam lever. If you can, then that means the valve is loose and it needs to be tightened back up. On the other side of things, whatever your thinnest feeler gauge is that's within spec, if it doesn't fit through and you don't have enough clearance for it, that means you need to loosen the valve up. I hope that makes just a little bit better sense. If you're gonna be off a little bit, it's better to be a little loose on the valves than it is to be tight on the valves. But anyway, you're gonna run these through here, here, here. We're over here on the other side of the engine. You're gonna run it through the cam and cam lever right there, the one right there, and then this back here is a little hard to get to, but you can see I can get the feeler gauge back in there to check it. Like I said, all mine are within spec. Your specifications may be a little different. I'm ready to start putting this motor back together. All right, so the first thing I'm gonna do is go ahead and put the alternator screw, cover, plug back in, whatever you wanna call it. I'll throw the spec up for torque on the screen. All right, so the next thing we wanna do is make sure everywhere around the top of this cylinder head is clean as possible. I'm gonna clean this up just a little bit more. Also, off camera, I cleaned up the valve cover a little bit better. Make sure there's no debris or anything around the edges where that gasket's gonna sit. And last but not least, if you had a bunch of sealant and stuff on the gasket, clean it up as good as possible as well. All right, so with the surface cleaned up, the next thing we want to do is grab some sort of sealant. I'm using Honda Bond. This is what I've always used. The manual calls for putting some right around here. I'm probably actually going to run it all the way through because if this valve cover gasket's going to leak anywhere, chances are it's going to be around these half moon cutouts. So I'm going to get all that prepped and then get the gasket placed back in place. All right, so with the gasket back in place, now we're going to take the valve cover. One thing you want to watch, there is an O-ring that sits right up around here where the spark plug goes in. Make sure you don't disturb it when you're putting the valve cover back on. You'll kind of feel it pop back down into place. Make sure the ridge goes back up into the little cutout there on the valve cover. There, you heard it all pop into place right there. All right, now it's time to put the valve cover bolts back into place. All right, so next up, we are gonna put the valve bolts in. Just a quick reminder, there are 3 O-rings, so if you were cleaning up the valve cover and they happen to fall out, just make sure you put them back in there before you go to put these back in. We're gonna start these by hand and then we're gonna torque them down to 8 Newton meters. So 8 Newton meters is equivalent to 5.9 foot-pounds of torque. I've actually purchased one of these KTM torque wrenches that goes from like 1 to 25 Newton meters. These things aren't cheap, but with as much maintenance as I have to do to the bikes, well worth it. So it's not very much torque on this thing. You definitely don't want to over tighten it. All right, so I've double checked all of the torque on all those bolts. Next thing we want to do, the breather hose, we're going to slide it back on and then slide the little hose clamp back on over it to hold it in place. You can see we've got that back in place. I'm going to go ahead and move over here to the radiator before we go to the spark plug. Right side of the radiator is relatively simple. We might have to pivot back into place a little bit and then we're going to grab our shield here and then get the 2 bolts put back in. All right, we've got the radiator guard back on. Now we're going to move on to the spark plug. As always, before inserting your new spark plug, make sure it is gapped correctly. I've checked this one, so now I'm going to get it put back in the motor. Now, unfortunately, I just realized I picked up the wrong spark plug from the shop, so I'm going to put the old one back in for right now. I'll pick another one up this week. If you want to torque this back down to spec, I generally don't do it. I normally just hand tighten it down so it's good and snug, but I have the torque wrench out. Calls for 10 to 12 Newton meters. One other quick thing, and I've got that torque back down. KTM does make a specific spark plug wrench tool, but if you just take a deep well socket, a universal, and a small extension, you'll see that it will fit down in there just fine without interfering with the frame. All right, so with the spark plug back in, the last thing we need to do is put the boot back in. I'm gonna clean this up a little bit, and then I'm gonna use a little bit of this silicone just to help treat the rubber a little bit, make sure it's obviously good and clean, and then that'll just keep it from drying out, make it last a little longer, and then we'll get it popped back down into place. All right, you can see that looks like new again. We're gonna feed this back down in under the frame. It's gonna be a little hard to do with just one hand, but get this pushed back down in and make sure it pops into place. All right, we've got the boot back down into place, and that's it. All right, guys, so that's pretty much it. That's how you check the valves and replace the spark plug on a KTM 250 XCF. Obviously, you still need to put the fuel tank back on. I'll link, I already linked that video earlier, but it'll be down in the description if you need to know how to do that. Other things you obviously need to do once you get the fuel tank back on, start the bike back up, make sure everything is functioning properly, and then check around that valve cover gasket to ensure you don't have any leaks. If you don't have any leaks, you're good to go ride again. So I hope you guys enjoyed today's video. If you did, please be sure to give it a big thumbs up. If you're not a subscriber, considering that subscribe button, because if you like motorcycles, well, this is the place to be. If you have any specific questions about checking the valves or replacing the spark plug, let me know down in the comments section below. And as always, I'll talk to you again soon.